want to do today, I'm going to go into, once again, this sort of remarkable business of trying to mix people and history with science. And in this case especially, we're going to run, I think, somewhat deeply into the issue of optics, at least a bit. I'm going to try and simplify the optics again to bring it up to date. But the topic for today is basically the history through the 19th century of what became sort of the perfection of the light microscope as far as theoretically possible. There were several changes that were introduced in the 20th century, but the basics of it were really put all together in the 19th century. And it was done through this remarkable series of people and events. I'll show you this thing at the end of the lecture, but I've got to start by showing you now. Because what I've got here is a kind of an intellectual path. It's a little trickier than that, though. But it basically starts with Matthias Schleiden, whom you may remember as the botanist who was the founder of the cell theory. And then this remarkable collection of people who are Carl Zeiss, Ernst Abbe, Otto Schott, and eventually, although we won't speak very much about him, August Köhler. Köhler is the one from whom we now think of as the founder of Köhler illumination in the microscope. So this is a history that goes in terms of lifespan, almost from 1800 all the way through to 1900, a full century of changes. I think that's sort of a remarkable bit of history, but most of it, and that's what I think is so interesting here, really involves this team of people, ultimately all working in the same company that was founded by Carl Zeiss, that made these major changes in the microscope. The other thing to keep in mind is that as we go through this history, that at the same time, we have the development of pathology through people like Virchow. We have neuroanatomy through Remak and Hiss. We have all of these other things happening at the same time during this century. It's really a kind of a remarkable awakening of material. So what I want to do then for today is to talk specifically about these three people, Carl Zeiss, Ernst Abbe, and Otto Schott. And again, as I mentioned, sort of suggested at the beginning, it's kind of a remarkable conjunction of people with three very different outlooks to begin with. They started with a very different perspective on the things that were important. And they ended up bringing it all together to unify a story about microscopes. So let me start. I'm going to give you some very sort of almost boring, basic background on each one of them. You'll notice also that the dates of birth extend quite a range, and yet they all work together. Okay, so Carl Zeiss was born in 1816. Abbe, 25 years later, and Schott another 10 years after that. So this is, quite a year's range of age for these people that ultimately work together. It's kind of, again, an interesting way to think about it. Okay, so let's start with Zeiss. Now I have to say, the biographies of Zeiss are a little tricky because a lot of them are written for the Carl Zeiss company, which still exists. Zeiss is still a major manufacturer of microscopes and telescopes, and surprisingly enough, eyeglasses. So there's quite a bit of somewhat self-serving literature that's been written by Zeiss people to explain Zeiss and to look at their history, which is it's kind of an interesting thing. You see it in essays like this one, written by Wolfgang Wimmer, and another one that I'll show you in a little bit, that also goes through some of this history. The basic idea of this is to think about where these people came from, what their backgrounds were, and what kind of path they took towards their careers, which I think is kind of fascinating. So we'll start with Carl Zeiss. And you can see Zeiss's father was actually a wood turner. That is, he was an artisan, and he was known for making things like ivory and amber and mother of pearl, all of these things into essentially decorative objects, right? Jewelry and toys. And so this is the kind of background that Carl Zeiss grew up in a certain sense, a mechanical approach, because this was a turner, right? He used wood turning as a basic principle, his father. But he used that as a way of creating artistic objects. And also, I think what you end up with is the sense that he had a certain kind of demand for precision, demand for accuracy, that you couldn't make a sloppy piece of jewelry. You actually had to be very precise in the way you put these things together. And you're using fairly precious materials, amber, ivory, things of that sort. At any rate, it was clear that Carl went to the local school and developed, as you might imagine, a real interest in technical things. And so he went to a bunch of schools and then ultimately ended up becoming what's listed here as a mechanic. Now, you may think of a mechanic in a different way. A mechanic at this time was not somebody that crawls around under your car and gets filthy. A mechanic at this time, in the 1830s or so, was pretty much an engineer, a high-class engineer. And so it was actually a fairly high-profile kind of work and highly respected. And so he ended up going to this town of Jena. And you may have heard the town, you'll see why in another minute. He went to this town of Jena where he started to work with a man, this is the sort of thing that blows my mind away, okay? Friedrich Körner was called the court mechanic, who was also a private lecturer at the university. A court mechanic meant that he was the engineer for the palaces, that sort of thing, okay? Keeping them going. And while Zeiss was studying with Körner, he started picking up lectures at the university and then picked up the general field of mechanical engineering. Now, Körner we'll get back to, because Körner, among other things, started making microscopes. And he, as you'll see, developed an association with Matthias Schleiden from earlier on. Schleiden was in Jena, also at the university. So Körner knew of him, and Schleiden encouraged him, and then later on encouraged Zeiss to devote a lot of his energy to microscopes. Zeiss initially traveled around to a number of different towns where he was a sort of a roving handyman, if you will. This is kind of an interesting perspective. But then eventually he came back to Jena, went to the university again to learn as much as he could about the material, and then founded his own company to make things, ultimately to make microscopes. And there was a statement by Schleiden at the time that Zeiss had familiarized himself with the needs of the science researchers. And so Zeiss formed this workshop and took over the microscope line that Kerner had started. By about this time, Kerner had passed away. And so, in a certain way, Zeiss inherited that. So he was running in the mid 40s, 1840s or so. He was starting to make microscopes. Okay? We'll file that moment, that business for the moment, and take a look now at, at Ernst Abbe. Abbe seems to have come out of a sort of, well, what do they call it? I love the term, a humble home. Okay? That is, he didn't come from a tradition of either high technology or high intellectual life or high money. He came from a home where his father was a foreman in a spinnery is a place that was making fabric, spinning thread or wool into thread. Okay? But this is sort of amazing. The father was working in this company, and the company was willing to support Abbe's education. It took him all the way through university, through the support of his father's employer. That's a pretty impressive thought. By the time he left school, of course, what was obvious was that he was clearly a very smart man with a great deal of interest in mathematical approaches. And eventually he got a Ph.D. for his theoretical work. Now, this is an interesting, as usual, there are fun facts thrown around in here. There was a group of professors at Göttingen. Göttingen was the university in which he spent some time. Okay? Group of professors who were known as politically liberal, who opposed the restrictions of the German government, or the fractions of German government at that time. Just to keep that in mind, because we'll be looking by the very end at some of the things that Abbe ended up doing in addition to his optics. At any rate, he qualified as a university lecturer, and normally you don't know what to do about these histories that include the marriage to some person. But Elsa Snell turns out to be the daughter of Carl Snell, and you may recall from physics or early optics something which is called Snell's law, which has to do with the reflection of light. Okay? And Snell was one of Abbe's teachers, and his daughter became his wife. In addition to all this, in 1866, by 1866, he had become associated with the Zeiss optical works. And I'll get to the history of why this happened in another minute or two. But by that time, he became part of the Zeiss operation as the person that became the lens designer. And we'll follow that through a little bit later. But as you can see in his career, he went from in 10 years to being a partner in the company. Okay? And eventually, Zeiss died before he did, and he became the director of the company. The last of the group is Otto Schott. And you'll know that Schott, after all, was quite a bit younger than the others. Okay? But he grew up, in his case, he was the son of a man who made window glass. So he had, if you will, glass in his veins at the very beginning. And so he was interested in glass and became very interested in the chemistry of glass and the way glass was assembled and made. So his career was pretty well laid out for him as an expert in glass science. And as you can see here, somewhere in around 1880, he started doing studies on different formulations of glass. Remember, glass is funny stuff. pretty much up until then, the glass was what you could get. And there were more or less two types of glass, what was called crown glass and flint glass. And it was clear that those two types of glass did behave differently with light. They refracted colors differently. They transferred light differently so that they could be used for various kinds of decorative things like chandeliers because of the way they would sparkle. But Schott became very interested in manipulating the composition of these various glasses by changing the salts that were added into them. And so at one point, he made a glass that included a fair amount of lithium as one of the options. And he wrote to Abbe. This was in 1879. So by then, Abbe and Zeiss were pretty well set up as a manufacturer of microscopes. And so he sent a note to Abbe saying, look, I made this glass. And the glass seems to have some unusual properties, some of which may be excellent optical properties. So maybe you'd like to take a look at it. You'll see in a moment that this was exactly what Abbe was waiting to hear from somebody he was looking for. And so the coincidence of having this information from Schott just at the time that Abbe needed additional glasses to be made turned out to be really very, very convenient. So eventually, he joined Zeiss and Abbe to form this major company. Okay? And as you read this, remember I told you some of the stuff is produced by the companies that are still in existence. So Schott AG is a German glass company, it's still there. And so at the end of the article, it says, oh yeah, by the way, as of 2020, we're making the glass that's being used for vaccination vials against the COVID-19 thing. It's kind of interesting to realize that as we go through this history, we're starting to bump up additionally, increasingly, against the modern world, against our own time. So, you start thinking, boy, look at these guys with all their big bearded faces, and they all look like something out of early 19th century. Their work is continuing through into the 20th century and then beyond into the 21st. It's a kind of a very interesting way to think about this. So let's get into a little bit then of what it was that made the Zeiss system so extraordinary. Basically, there were three goals that they had as a company. And this was the sort of stuff that came out of Zeiss's interests as an engineer. As he took over the microscope business from Kerner, he realized that what they were doing was hand making these things and sort of gradually manufacturing them almost by accident. They say that what happened was Zeiss had to look individually at each microscope that was made by people in his factory, even if he wasn't doing it himself. And if the microscopes were flawed in any way, he would destroy them. So these people would put these things together and then he would say, no good, throw them out. So Zeiss himself established standards for manufacture and quality of and as he did that, he realized that you really had to do something like that to keep the lenses the same. You had to develop but the problem was that at that point, the lenses were being all hand ground by people. And what they would do is grind them and look at the surface and see, well, is that going to be what I want or not? And then grind some more and then change it again. And he felt, Zeiss, that it was necessary to calculate the needed parameters. So he felt that this was necessary. And at the time, just as I would say, or an appropriate similar amount of time, he became aware of the work of Abbe, who was doing just these kinds of calculations. So he asked Abbe to start working with him because of his interests in physics. Abbe was first involved in standardizing design of the lenses. And then Abbe got caught up in trying to improve them. And so he improved them initially in this interesting way of just trying to see, remember, to correct for chromatic aberration. Remember, we pointed out in the earlier lecture that you could correct for chromatic aberration if you combine a concave lens with a convex lens. And the reason for that was that the two different lenses, if they were made out of different glass, the different glasses would disperse the rays of the colors differently, so that there would be some subtle differences between the way the reds were bent versus the blues were bent. And if you balance those two against each other, you would be able to, and here's, if I take the blue light that was coming through here and it bends this way, and then I turn it here and it goes this way a bit and then goes out again like that. So the light's going in a certain direction. And then I treat the same idea with the red. Now the red light coming in here would be bent a different pattern, say more this way. And then it would enter the lens, but the lens would bend it less this time, so that when it finally left the lens, it would be more or less coincident with the blue light. And so the colored light would be basically brought back together again. The problem was that worked for the ends of the spectrum. So if you have a spectrum, all right, so here's the spectrum, here's your red light, and here's your blue light. Now, what about the green? Well, it turns out that the green could have been anywhere. So you could have a green image floating in space, say over here, even while the rest of your image, and I'll put it in black because it includes the red and the blue, would be over here. And so you still had a chromatic aberration. And so what Abbe did was he went through the calculations of what was needed in order to add additional lenses to this sort of system, either concave or convex or some combination of it, with specific both refractive index and dispersion characteristics. Okay. So one of the things he did, interesting, is he tried making lenses in which, and the only way I can draw it is vertical because otherwise it seems even more ridiculous. Okay, so here's a lens, and here's the objective portion, the outside portion of the lens, and here is the second part of the lens, perhaps like this. Okay, and then another, maybe you try another lens up here. And then what he'd do is seal this over here, put a kind of an O-ring around the inside. and fill it with liquid. What kinds of liquid would he use? Well, he used high refractive index liquids, oils of one form or another, plant oils or things of that sort. Cinnamon oil was apparently one of the biggies to use. And the idea was that the liquids would create a much smoother interface, and you could adjust the refractive index of those liquids and in some way be able to get better correction of the chromatic aberration. They actually manufactured these things, and they were called, I'll probably mistype this, but it was called something like Pawley up, not only up. Lenses, okay? And so these were lenses that contained a liquid, but this really turned out not to be very satisfactory. And so once again, he needed, this is first, remember, Zeiss needed somebody to calculate lenses at all. Abbe needed somebody who understood how to get varying kinds of glass, okay? And remember this note that came from Schott. He said, "Hey, I've got some glass you might want to think about." And so he established a connection now with Schott. And so as a result of that collaboration with Schott to generate glass of specific dispersion so that he could combine that into the lenses and ultimately end up with something that was called a plan apochromat lens, which meant it was apochromatic, that is to say, all colors the plan meant that the field of focus was flat. So he was able to do this and make these remarkable lenses that were apochromatic. But then Abbe had a kind of a revelation, a discovery. This is all written up in a wonderful essay, and I'll post it's a pretty long description, so I'm not going to go through it, but I may post it just if you want to see what is in Abbe's mind. There was a translation done for the Bristol Naturalist Society, and it's an excellent translation, so I'll post that for you. At any rate, Abbe now had, quote, perfect lenses, but he looked through them, he put them in microscopes and looked at stuff and discovered that they weren't very good. The images that he saw were still not as good as things that he might have seen, for instance, from a simple microscope. And he realized that the difference was somehow the opening of the lens, the aperture of the lens. So let me remind you now about lens apertures very briefly. Here's a lens. And if I just take the middle just because it's something I can look at, right? And I say, how much light gets into that lens? Well, sometimes the light, if it's a small lens, gets only into a certain amount of the lens. And other times you can have a much larger opening for the lens. So the idea is that this large distance, or this distance of opening from here to here, is the aperture of the lens. And the amount of light that gets into a lens like this is not only a matter of the opening of the lens, but also something about the medium through which it travels. So it actually has to do with the refractive index of the medium. And Abbe realized that the larger the aperture, the clearer, terrible term, but I'll use it, the image, as well as the brighter. Well, that it's brighter is not a surprise. You're letting more light through. But that it made it clearer was a real puzzle for him. And so let me give you an example of that first so that you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, here are two examples. Here's one where the aperture of the lens goes from being small to being large. And what you can see is that when the aperture is small, the image is actually less distinct than when the aperture is large. And I'll give you one more example, which is kind of, in some ways, cuter. Okay, here's a series of some sort of set of spots. It's not important for which. And you can see that these numbers, which represent the aperture, numerical aperture, go from 0.2 to 1.3. And you can see the difference in clarity. This is actually one of those apps that's built into the microscopy website. So I'm going to see if we can make that happen. And you can see it in something like real life. Now, there are two components to this diagram. One of them is what they call an airy disk. And some of you may all remember there is something called an airy disk, which is the diffraction fringes around an object. But here's the idea. In this system, I can manually adjust this aperture. And when I do, one of the things that happens is that the disk size gets smaller. It's just sort of a side issue. What matters is what happens to the image of the sample, which is on the left. And you see that what's happening is I go from this blurred thing where, yeah, I can sort of count the number of things that are there, but I can't tell you anything about them. Whereas as I move it, as I close this open this aperture up, I get to see more and more detail, and I get to see something about their sizes and something about what's in them. I'm also picking up a lot of extra fringes around them, which is an artifact of what they have. But that's the basic idea, that by playing around with this numerical aperture, you can change the amount of sharpness of the image. Okay? That was Abbe's observation. So Abbe's observation was now that the larger lens aperture, the brighter and clearer the image. Ultimately, this became the expression of resolution, which you by now have all heard too much about, right? I won't go through the Abbe formula for resolution. But I do want to give you a little bit of what then went on in Abbe's mind, because he did write this up. He published it almost in this personal way. So what he said was, he was looking at the way the light, if he had a spot sample, a small sample, and he was looking at the light that was going into the lens, so we have a lens over here. There was, in the sense of the sort of simple optics that was being used, the geometric optics that I've used for drawing images, the light went through here into the lens, big deal. But if he looked at the edges, what he discovered was that there was a whole region that he called the dark space. What an interesting term, right? So this was the dark space. And eventually he realized that what he was looking at was basically a diffraction pattern. So remember, if you have a spot, let's see, I'll put it right here. If you have a spot and you shine a light on it, what you actually get from it is this sort of pattern of waves going past the object, but you also, for interesting reasons, get a secondary structure that goes around it this way. And what you end up with as a wave phenomenon is a central wave that's very strong, and a weak signal off to the side. And these things are called the diffraction fringes. So Abbe had this incredible insight that the diffraction fringes were important to forming the image. In other words, you had to have something from this dark space get into the lens. Now it was dark only because the diffraction fringes, remember if we draw a diffraction pattern, it's very bright and then a couple of smaller pieces, secondaries. Okay, so if you're just looking at this, you see this thing is very bright and this all tends to look kind of dark. And so what Abbe realized or proposed was that you had to have diffraction fringes in order to get this image complete. And so he made a device to prove this to people. And this is a computer model for that. It was put together by some wonderful people, James Pawley and Guy Cox, who are, Pawley I think is now passed away. Guy Cox is still active in Australia, and we may get to talk about him a little bit later. Okay? Anyway, here's the way this game works. You start with a microscope, and you start by putting a sample in. So I clicked on sample, and I can now adjust the focus of that sample. Out of focus, oh, almost in focus, out of focus. Should say if it's in focus. Yeah, see? Focused. And you can see this is a special kind of sample in that the sample consists of lines that are closely drawn to each other. Historically, lines like this were developed as a model by Fraunhofer, who developed diffraction gratings at the turn of the 19th century. And it was through the use of these diffraction gratings that you actually saw the characteristic lines from, say, the light of the sun or various compounds, their emission color lines, because the diffraction grating separated out different colors. Okay? Now, there's another lens in this microscope. This is part of Zeiss's design. Okay? That there's an extra piece that you can put in called a Bertrand lens. And those of you that remember phase contrast know that this is basically a phase telescope. And so you're looking at a spot somewhere up in here in the microscope. And what you see, interestingly enough, let's adjust the focus. Is a diffraction pattern of different colors put in by this object. Okay? In other words, let's see if I can say it in a simple way, that if you have a sample it'll come back. If you have a sample and you send an image through the lens, eventually, comes on my little arrow snap. Eventually that arrow shows up here. But on the way, the light forms a diffraction pattern partway up the lens, in the back focal plane of the objective lens. We won't, you don't need to remember that. But at any rate, we're looking at this spot which is this band of colors. So now what we've done is we've said, look, these are the lines that are coming through. Supposing I block out some of them, what happens to my image? So there are tools, and maybe the simplest to use, well, we can use an iris. An iris is a diaphragm that you close and open, okay? And here's the idea. Let's open the iris first. What the iris is doing is closing off some of the fringes here as I close it down. And you'll see that what happens as I close them down, at some point, I lose the detail of the very fine component of this image. Why is that? Well, remember that the way a diffraction pattern works is that, and we'll get rid of this will disappear from you. If your materials are close together, the diffraction pattern spreads out a great deal more. Okay? So you would have the central part going forward this way, but the edges would be out quite a distance. If your sample was closer together, sorry, not closer, were further apart, if your sample were more coarse, then the diffraction lines will be closer. So what we're doing in this software, when I close the aperture down like that, when I close this iris down, what I'm doing is I'm basically saying, let's capture these rays of light, but not the ones from the edge. Okay? So if I leave out the ones from the edge, then I won't get the detail that comes from the really fine detail in the sample. But I will get it from the coarser material. Okay? There's a lot more to this, but this is enough to give you the sense that what Abbe did that was truly remarkable is he said, look, in the classic way of figuring out optics, we would use what we would call a ray trace diagram. Remember, you saw me do this earlier, where I just go ahead and say that the light coming from this object goes through here, passes through the focal point, the light passes, more light, other rays from the sample go through the center, and ultimately I'll end up with an image of the arrow upside down. That's the classic ray tracing, if you will, optics, right? What Abbe said was that at a certain level, this works fine for certain kinds of optics, but when you really need critical results, when you really need to look at the resolution of your system, you really have to have your lens so that it captures not just the central rays, but it actually has to capture all of these peripheral things that are coming out. And if it doesn't, you won't get the highest resolution. So what this meant for the Zeiss company, remember there's a company, what this meant for the Zeiss company was that they redesigned their lenses to have large apertures. And the large aperture lenses, which was the innovation that Zeiss came up with, were the ones that had the best optics. And that built the reputation of the company. Okay? So there's one more point I want to make about this very interesting company and the people who did it. I suggested something at one point very briefly, which was that Abbe had been involved with a liberal group, politically liberal group, and he was even a student in Göttingen. Same thing actually with Schott to a certain extent. When they finally formed the company, they decided that they would implement a certain number of very specific kinds of principles. First of all, they more or less made the employees the management of the company. Certain level of management. But more importantly, they were involved in profit sharing. That is, as the company did well, these people got an extra bonus for what they were producing, so that the profits of the company went to the employees. They set up, this is at the end of the 19th century, an 8-hour work week, paid vacation, health care, and this was all established through what they did was they changed the ownership of the company to a foundation that was no longer owned by the individuals per se, but run as a corporation might these days, as a larger thing by a committee, by the people that worked it. This is remarkable material. These are remarkable reforms for the turn of the 20th century. And so, although Zeiss is not as well known for this social stuff, the effect of Abbe's contribution to the Zeiss company, which was then absorbed, completely supported by Schott, was a major change in the social structure of industry, if you will, in Germany, certainly within this company. There was sort of a remarkable second part of this story that you have to include as well as talking about the optics. Okay? So I think that's where I'll be able to end today's talk.